Something shocking is happening in China. Chinese citizens are now openly calling for the overthrow of Xi Jinping. Just a few days ago, a Chinese university dean and her deputy openly published a signed manifesto. In this manifesto, they called for Chinese students to rise up and topple the government of Xi Jinping, much like the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989. The manifesto warns students that if they don't stand up today, they will become another victim of history tomorrow. It tells the students to demand for democracy, freedom, and human rights. The message here is clear. They want China to stop being a country of lies and violence, but rather become a democracy with the rule of law and justice. They want Xi Jinping's dictatorship to end. This letter is then signed with the author's name and picture. To do something like this in China, especially right now, takes a kind of courage that we cannot even imagine. Just months ago, an economist called out the party for lying about GDP numbers. That economist has not been seen since. These professors are openly speaking out against Xi Jinping, and it's impossible to overstate that this does not happen in a country like China. Last time Chinese students asked for democracy and the rule of law, the CCP brought out tanks and massacred its own citizens. Thousands of students were killed for wanting freedom, and worse yet, the party erased their memories from Chinese history. According to the CCP, nothing happened on June 4th, 1989. In fact, Xi Jinping is still spending billions to rewrite the history of that night. Here is a pro-CCP account lying about how it was Americans who were killed at Tiananmen. Sadly, this fake history got 500,000 views on Twitter, and that's because CCP bots promote this content that pushes the CCP's narrative. When we tried covering the true story of what happened that night, our video was heavily downvoted by CCP bots. Because of that, it got less than 50,000 views. That's why, if there's any video where I need your help the most, it's this one. If you guys can please take a second and hit that like button and subscribe button down below, it truly does help us defeat the CCP bots. And if you think more people need to learn the truth about the CCP, then please share this on your social media accounts. Let's go over how the CCP killed democracy in China. Now, most of you likely know what happened on the 4th of June, 1989. But the story of how the CCP got there is one that's getting lost in history. The story that the CCP wants the world to forget. A story they have already erased from Chinese history. To truly understand how we got to June 4th, 1989, we actually have to back up to when Mao died. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Mao, he was the founder of the CCP and also the first chairman of the party. We can actually make a video on just his life, but for today, I'm just going to focus on the parts that are important to this story. Mao was a big ol' communist. He truly loved communism, even though his policies killed tens of millions of people. In fact, his economic plans were so bad that he had to resign as chairman of the country in 1959. But he continued causing problems for people who tried to stir the country away from his failed policies. And that's how we got the Cultural Revolution. That, again, deserves a video in itself. Mao used the students in the country to kill and root out many opponents. Basically, people who didn't want his brand of communism. His authoritarian communism known as Maoism. This is important, as students will play a big role later on, too. So when he died, things changed, and they changed fast. This guy came into power, Deng Xiaoping. When compared to Mao, he was like Adam Smith. He wanted China to open up, embrace more capitalism, and become a rule of law country. He went to Singapore and noticed how fast the country had improved. It had gone from a third world country to a first world country in just a few decades. Best of all, he was ecstatic to see that it was not a capitalist, free speech, and democracy-loving place like the USA. It was still an authoritative regime, but one that was rich and successful. Deng wanted to do the same with China. He famously said, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." Meaning, he wanted the economy to work, and that's the only goal. It doesn't really matter how it works. He was not concerned with making sure that government actions fit within a predetermined definition of communism or socialism. He was far more concerned with the question of, does it work? If something works somewhere, well, let's try it. And if it's fine in China, let's continue it. If it doesn't work, toss it out and let's try another one. That's how Singapore became successful. And that's how Deng wants China to be successful. An important note is that Deng wanted just economic reforms, not political ones. People were not about to get freedom of speech and democracy, no. But there were people in the party who wanted more. Meaning they wanted political reforms, more transparency, and all that Western BS like democracy. One of the people was Deng's own protege, Hu Yaobang. Deng and Hu had been jailed together multiple times before and during the Cultural Revolution of Mao. They trusted each other. So in 1981, Deng made Hu party general secretary, second highest position in the party after Chairman Deng. They worked closely together to bring all the changes that China went through during the 1980s. They both also wanted to set up a generational change system in the party so leaders at the top don't cling to power until their last dying breath. They wanted young leadership involved in the decision-making process and older leaders to retire at an appropriate age. But the speed at which they both wanted this differed greatly, and this is where the problem started. Deng believes this process would take 10 to 15 years to fully implement. He was 82. He didn't think he would live to see the end of it. This didn't mean he didn't want to start the generational change system. He was actually happy to retire at the next Congress. But he knew others would not be on board so quickly. Then there's the question of who will be next and who will be in line to replace the positions the next leaders leave open. Hu, on the other hand, wanted to move fast. Similar to Deng, he was okay with retiring soon and starting the generational change system. In fact, he had already picked out young leaders who should become part of the CCP. Others in the party who weren't on board with retiring yet saw this move as a bit opportunistic by Hu. They believed that he just wanted to increase the power of his faction, a faction that favored more openness and transparency, while other people didn't want to give up this power quite yet. Hu didn't realize that Deng was not as sure of the generational change system as he was. Deng wanted it, but he still had other people in his ear saying it's not a good idea. Things may be moving too fast. One of those people was Li Peng, who also had a close relationship with Deng, but, like Hu, was quite opposed to his viewpoints. This is the beginning of the conflict that starts within the CCP, that eventually leads to what happened at Tiananmen Square, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Talking about moving fast, the speed at which Deng's regime was changing the economic policy, well, problems were bound to happen. Before, students were pretty much guaranteed a job by the CCP when they graduated. And now they had to compete for jobs because of this new system. On top of that, corruption was rampant. Jobs were supposed to be merit-based, but in reality, it was more political. Your dad is a party official, you get a job without even interviewing. Students felt like they got all the hard parts about the new system, but not the benefits. So there were big protests in 1986 around many major campuses in China. The size of the demonstrations shocked the government. Unlike the Cultural Revolution, the government was determined not to lose control over the student groups. Hu was close to the student and young leaders, so he didn't really criticize the protest. On top of that, one of his job responsibilities was to stop any opposition against the new CCP's policy, which he also didn't do because he kind of agreed with the students. They wanted more freedom and more fair structure in the economy. They wanted reforms even faster. And so did he. Deng didn't really like this. Deng asked to get things under control and fire the two student leaders who were spearheading the protests, while also being members of the CCP party. Hu completely denies firing the student leaders, as he still believed young leaders should have more say in the party, not less. So Hu was forced to resign from the party's general secretary position. This was a big change, since Hu was in line to replace Deng as the party leader, and now it's Zhao Ziyang who takes Hu's place as general secretary. Li Peng was now the party premier, third highest position in the party. But he was still part of the inner circle, as he retained his seat in the Politburo Standing Committee. One thing Deng didn't realize yet is that Zhao actually also kinda agreed with Hu and student leaders. He wanted the party to move more towards liberal policies, while Li Peng was still a staunch red-blooded communist who believed in Mao's way of doing things. The infighting among the top leaders is about to get even worse, as we will soon see. On top of forcing Hu to resign, the party also forced him to publicly criticize all the mistakes he has made, like pushing for freedom and democracy. It was a move to humiliate him and weaken his supporters. Unfortunately, the public, especially the students, saw this as what it was. Instead of hurting Hu's reputation, it actually strengthened the loyalty among his supporters. Hu became an example of a man who refused to compromise his convictions in the face of political resistance, and who had paid the price as a result. Though he maintained his position in the Politburo, it was mostly just for namesake. He had no real power after this. Pace of reform slowed down even more, especially political reforms. Deng and other party members became even more cautious of not giving power to anyone remotely like Hu. 2 years later, on April 15, 1989, Hu started feeling dizzy during an official meeting, asked to be excused for a minute, and as he was walking away, he collapsed to the ground with a fatal heart attack. One of the most powerful and popular leaders just a few years ago had just died. Students and workers alike felt that they had just lost their hope for freedom, their hope for democracy. So they took to the street to mourn Hu's death. As the darkness of the night set in, mourning turned to protesting. Students started shouting slogans in favor of freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. At some universities, students started signing petitions to demand that the party hold a state funeral for Yao Bang to the highest standards. By the next morning, news had spread everywhere in China. People were starting to gather at the monument to the people's heroes in Tiananmen Square to mourn the passing. It was still a small crowd at the square, maybe 100, 200 at most, but many state newspapers published pictures and reports from this gathering. Now, this seemed like a normal thing. Some angry people, but mostly just people grieving. Well, the CCP didn't like this reporting. They thought the newspaper covering the story is just going to push more people to go to the square and mourn. Li Peng, China's premier at the time, wrote, "The consequences will be chaos in the social order." Little did he know what was about to happen. Whether it was papers or it was the CCP being unhappy with the papers, the next day, 600 people marched to the square. The CCP saw the growing support, and the funeral committee decided to announce the highest level funeral for Yao Bang, where 4,000 people would be allowed at the viewing ceremony and 100,000 people at the memorial ceremony the next day. After the announcement, Premier Li Peng comes in and says no to the 100,000 people gathering. Letting the masses pay their respect to Yao Bang's remains will inevitably cause even greater chaos in society. Clearly, this seemed like too much to the students. The party isn't even letting them mourn the death of their beloved leader, one who was also a high-ranking member of the party. In response, universities around the country started putting up posters to tell the public that they should just go to Tiananmen Square to pay their respects. Posters also included suggestions like autocratic politics should be abolished, a new democratic political order should be established, and there should be a review of major mistakes made during the 10 years of reform, with those responsible to resign. Basically, the message was, go to Tiananmen Square and we will change China. And people actually started going. Thousands of students from many different universities marched overnight to the square, then went to the entrance of the Great Hall of China and demanded to meet Premier Li. They had 7 demands for him. The major one being, affirm Hu Yaobang's views on democracy and freedom as correct. Someone took these demands to Li Peng, and Li took them to Xiao Qiang. Here we see 2 factions forming already in how to respond to the crowd that seems to be growing exponentially at Tiananmen Square. Li is an old-school communist. He wants to stop the mourning before things get out of hand, while Xiao wants to let people be as long as there's no breaking or looting. As we will learn in the coming days, Xiao is in fact a lot closer to Yao Bang's school of thought. He wants these students to have freedom and stuff, while Li wants to control every little thing and crush any sign of rebellion the moment it happens. At the end of the day, students are left to be, while police are instructed to keep a close eye by Li. He orders them to squash anything problematic as soon as they catch it and before things get out of hand. By the next day, the crowd had grown to 10,000 people at the square. In just 4 days, it went from 100 to 10,000, and it will just continue going up. From now on, we will have a counter of the rough number of protesters with the date here on the screen. The next day, something quite inciting happened. Some police officers patrolling around the square found 3 students alone, and they started just roughing them up. In return, students chanted things like, "They will take down the dictatorship. To want freedom is not a crime." This led to cops really beating up the students so badly that one of them fell unconscious. This news spread like wildfire and rejuvenated whatever momentum the protest was losing. Many more universities decided to take part in the protest and march to the square. Student leaders also said that if the CCP doesn't respond to their 7 demands soon, they will start calling on workers, farmers, intellectuals, and other people from all walks of life to support the demonstrations. As the sun set on the 21st of April, more than 50,000 people were at Tiananmen Square. Worse yet, the Yaobang Memorial was the next morning, and police were ordered to clear up the streets for the vehicles that were expected to arrive. The country's top leadership, like Deng Xiaoping, Xiao, and Li Peng, are expected to attend. It seemed like an impossible task. By midnight, the number had grown to 400,000 people, as students from all universities had come for a memorial service. This was the first large-scale, unofficial demonstration that had happened in China since the establishment of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949. The military commissioner actually just had to come out and negotiate with the student leaders to clear the passage for guests for the memorial, as the force wasn't going to work against nearly 500,000 people. Luckily, an agreement was made and students were guaranteed mourning in peace, and they were, in return, expected to maintain order. The morning of the 22nd, the memorial went as planned. The crowd was so big that everyone couldn't enter the square. The line stretched as far as 10 miles or 16 kilometers from the gates, as everyone arrived to pay their respects. A turnout this big that surprised and even scared the party leaders, who were all in attendance. After the memorial, anger started spreading across the student masses. Student leaders went to the entrance of the Great Hall and knelt on the steps with demands in their hands. But no leader came out to meet with the students. This in turn made the students more angry, and the crowd started roaring. There was a wave of rioting in the square. As students from higher universities left the square to return home, they decided to organize an indefinite strike from classes until the CCP listened to their demands. This turns into a much bigger deal as teachers and workers will join the strikes too. After the funeral, the next day, Cao Ziyang leaves for North Korea. Remember, he's the cool guy and the second-in-command to Deng. In his absence, Li Peng becomes in charge. Li decided that mourning had turned into turmoil. He believed that there was something behind it, pulling the strings and inciting trouble, and that the movement was an organized and planned political struggle to overthrow the Communist Party. So they made the Central Committee Turmoil Suppression Group. The first thing the committee does is meet with Deng Xiaoping and get him to agree that they need to squash this movement. Remember, Xiao Qiang is still in North Korea, and he was the balancing/cooling head in all of this. After this meeting, Deng therefore wanted to mobilize the people of the entire country and the whole party to stand up and take a clear-cut stand against turmoil, and to try to avoid bloodshed as much as possible. But it is impossible to avoid this possibility entirely. We are still very far from June 4th, but the de facto leader had just told his commanders that bloodshed is likely to happen. Just, minimize it as much as possible. Li took these words and decided to publish an editorial in the state newspaper the next day titled, "We must take a clear-cut stand against turmoil." The editorial classified the mourning events for Hu Yaobang and the protests by students and members of the general public that had just taken place over the previous few days as serious incidents of beating, smashing, looting, and burning, and as turmoil incited by a very small number of people with ulterior motives. Basically saying anyone against the party is a danger to society and needs to be purged. This raised the stakes for protesting students. They are now being called traitors for trying to improve the country and uproot corruption. They are trying to follow in Hu Yaobang's footsteps, and the party is saying they need to be purged. This April 26th editorial turned what was, so far, mostly mourning and anger into full-on protest. Student leaders went public, now calling for everyone to take to the street and condemn the editorial. In return, the party announced that the commemoration of Hu Yaobang had ended, and more demonstrations moving forward would be illegal. Many students decided to march on April 27th anyway, knowing full well it might be their last march. A huge majority of those who marched had written their final testament, a death note, and left their dorms before marching. Many contained words to the effects of, "I'm heading out tomorrow, and I'm prepared not to come back. I hope future generations will remember why we made this sacrifice." The April 27th demonstration had so many people that it had now become the biggest since the founding of the CCP. Protests were happening all across the country, but by far the largest ones occurred in Beijing. Students from all the universities decided to march to Tiananmen Square while people lined up on the roads to cheer them on. Roughly 200,000 students joined the march to the square, and more than 1 million people lined up to cheer them on. And even with such huge numbers, there was still no conflict. The army was brought in to stop the protesters, but students started chanting slogans like, "People's Army loves its people." In the end, the army did not have the numbers to stop the demonstrations, probably didn't have the will either. Now, the foreign press is covering the protests, and that's how big things are getting. There was so much pressure on the party that it had to let the state news media report on the demonstration because the public was getting angry about the news suppression that was happening over the last few days. This kind of tied Premier Li's hands, and he had to instruct officials to start a dialogue with the students. In reality, this dialogue attempt was really all just for show. The party refused to talk with actual leaders, instead just pretended to listen to the students who had their demands handwritten by the party officials themselves. So the true leaders of the demonstration decided to call this dialogue attempt a BS move and took it to the media, calling for Li to meet with them in a televised debate. Things were getting so out of hand that on the 30th of April, Zhao had to end his trip and return from North Korea. In the next Politburo meeting, Zhao advocated that they should continue to focus on persuasion, conduct multi-level, multi-channel, multi-form dialogue, and resolutely persuade students to resume classes as soon as possible. He also mentioned that the Communist Party must adapt to the new era and new situations, and learn to solve new problems by means of democracy and rule of law. Li Peng and his allies argue that social stability must be restored before any reforms can be considered. Li Peng also believed Deng was on his side, since the meeting they had while Zhao was in North Korea. On May 4th, the students tried one last big show of a demonstration to get the dialogue from the party, but nothing really happened. Zhao did publicly acknowledge his support for the students' demands in a speech to bankers. He called them patriots and directly contradicted Li Peng's April editorial. This caused even more infighting in the party. But after the May 4th march, the movement started dying off. 80% of students around the country had returned to class, and only a dedicated few from Beijing were now continuing the class strikes and demonstrations. But tensions still persisted within the party, and patience was not an option anymore for party leaders. You see, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was coming for a summit on May 15th, the first visit by a Russian leader in 30 years. The Soviets and China had a falling out in the late 1950s, and this was the first attempt at repairing those relationships. Deng did not want to be embarrassed by student protests in the Tiananmen Square, as that's where Gorbachev's welcoming ceremony was going to be held. So he ordered Zhao to get rid of all the protesters from the square. Zhao used his soft approach and tried negotiating with the students. He thought he could make an emotional appeal to students, and they would listen, as he has shown his support for their movement sincerely in the past. But the students refused to leave the square. They knew the Gorbachev visit meant there was a lot of press freedom in China, and even foreign journalists were going to be there. To take advantage of the situation and put more pressure on the government, around 1,000 students announced a hunger strike in Tiananmen Square on May 13th, 2 days before Gorbachev's arrival. By now, the students' main demand was simple: retract the April 26th editorial and rebrand the movement as patriotic and democratic. Students clarified that they have no plans to overthrow the government, they just want Yaobang's reforms to be implemented quicker. News of the hunger strike helped galvanize the movement once again. People started coming in from all around the country, and marches were carried out in many different provinces. You see, in China, Hunger and food is kind of a sensitive and emotional topic for many citizens. China has experienced some of the worst famines in human history. In fact, there were many citizens who had lost family members because of it in their lifetime. So when students announced a hunger strike, it really hit a chord with many citizens. They started paying more attention to student demands, especially since the press actually had some freedom now to cover it on a day-to-day basis. Because of increased momentum, Gorbachev's welcoming ceremony was moved to the airport, but the summit was still held at the Great Hall, where the students were on hunger strike, right outside. During the meeting with Gorbachev, Xiao reaffirms to him that Deng Xiaoping is the leader of China and the CCP, even though he has no official position at the top. That's because just a few years back, Deng eliminated the position of chairman because he didn't want someone like Mao to take over the party and become bigger than the party. After eliminating the chairman position, general secretary was the highest position in the CCP, which was Xiao, but in reality Deng was still the main leader. So that's what Xiao was clarifying to Gorbachev, but Deng took this to mean that Xiao was putting the blame of the protesters outside on Deng, saying that he is the leader. The divide between Deng and Xiao is growing, and we have to remember Xiao, much like Yao Bong, is in the camp of more freedom for citizens, faster reform. Most importantly, let's not use force on students who are protesting for relatively, reasonable things. Xiao is the leader of the camp that is trying to balance out Li Peng and the old-school leaders who want to crush the student protesters. Over the next few days, as the summit progressed, the support for students only grew, and the movement had now regained all of its lost momentum. That's why even after Gorbachev left, many foreign journalists decided to stay in Beijing to continue covering these student protests. And that's a big reason why we have the footage from the massacre. As we will soon cover, the CCP tried everything in its power to make sure no one sees what happened that night. So, on May 17th, the top brass of the CCP meets at Deng's house. Here, Xiao is saying, let's just retract the editorial. That's all they're asking for. It's not even that big of a deal. But now Deng is fighting against Xiao, not just Li Peng. Deng says that Xiao made a mistake publicly supporting the students and telling them their demands are reasonable. Now, they know there is division in the CCP, which gives them even more power. So Deng decides that there is no other options but to declare martial law and send in the military. At this meeting, Xiao knew he had lost all the influence he had over Deng and all the power in the party. But still, he couldn't bring himself to be general secretary of a party that was about to use the army on its students. So he wrote up a resignation letter and planned to submit it. He was moments away from submitting when someone close to him convinced him to not do so, as that will only escalate the situation and likely make matters worse for the students and his family. So, instead of resigning, he takes a leave of absence from the party during a meeting. He tells his colleague before leaving that his life mission ends here. Then he goes to visit the students one last time, addressing them with a megaphone.
另外，你们也知道啊，北京的情况也不能再继续下去了。我们这个城市啊，又是首都啊，各方面现在严重的情况啊，一天一天在增加。
He urges them to end the hunger strike and continue their movement some other way, as many students on the strike are getting extremely weak now. Many could tell, with the way he was talking, that he was done. This was his goodbye to the students, and as it turned out, his last public appearance. And the students actually felt it too, as many started crying while he was speaking. At the end of his speech, Xiao bowed to the students in the square to show his respect one last time and walked away from the square as he knew he couldn't face what was about to happen. Clearly, this resonated with students and angered the remaining top leaders at the CCP. The next day, Li announced martial law on state television, and 250,000 soldiers were ready to march into Beijing. Student leaders learned of the plan to declare martial law, and they called off their hunger strike. Instead, they staged a mass sit-in in Tiananmen Square that drew about 1.2 million supporters, including members of the police and military and industrial workers. The movement had garnered so much support that more than 1 million students and workers stood at major entry points into the city, forming a human wall to stop the military from entering. More than 1 million people. On top of that, there were members of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, who were joining the protesters, and many retired PLA generals wrote to the CCP opposing martial law. There was a standstill between the army and protesters blocking the entry, and it lasted for 4 long days. Many soldiers were from Beijing and nearby cities, so they had family members who were at the protest, some even standing in front of them. This was clearly an emotional moment, so soldiers themselves, they couldn't bring themselves to use force on people they knew and people who made emotional pleas to them. Sometimes protesters actually provided food and water for soldiers and shared a meal with them. So the army couldn't break through and had to withdraw and set up bases outside of the city. Protesters saw this as a turning of the tide. They thought the army was on their side. The public was on their side. All they had to do was get party officials to see this and everything would fall into place. But in reality, the army did not withdraw to give up. They withdrew to regroup. In fact, the CCP decided to bring in even more soldiers for a final assault. Soldiers from different parts of China, so there would not be these emotional issues anymore. The army was planning on coming in, and this time they were not letting human roadblocks stop them. That night was just a calm before one of the deadliest storms. In the meantime, Beijing was the freest city in China. There was no police presence, and all the free press. In Tiananmen Square, the atmosphere was jubilant. But at the government headquarters, Deng Xiaoping is devising a new offensive to end the protest. By June 2nd, troops had started covertly moving into the city in civilian clothes to avoid attention. Tens of thousands of troops actually walked through the city in plain clothes and went into the Great Hall from a side entrance. Then, weapons and gear were transported into the Great Hall through local buses for these soldiers. Around 25,000 soldiers entered the Great Hall by the end of the night. This time, the plan was to squeeze the protesters from both sides. The PLA would march from the outside of the city, while soldiers in the Great Hall would move forward from the inside of the city. Some protesters had already begun to notice the PLA soldiers in plain clothes, and fights had broken out in multiple places in the city. Some buses carrying weapons and supplies were also intercepted by protesters, which led to even more anger among the students. Clashes were picking up all over the city as police and soldiers tried to get into position. This news quickly traveled up to the top, and Deng Xiaoping decided to give the final order to his general. He gave his troops the authority to use all possible methods to clear the square. This was the ultimate permission to kill from the head of the party. The next day, plans to march into the city were set in motion. The government issued an emergency announcement urging citizens to stay off the streets and away from Tiananmen Square. Once the word spread that hundreds of thousands of soldiers are planning on entering the city once again, the citizens flooded the streets in hopes of mounting the same defense as a week prior. At 8 p.m., June 3rd, 1989, the onslaught had begun. The army marched down Chang'an Avenue with the goal to reach Tiananmen Square no matter what. When they first encountered protesters' blockades, troops fired rubber bullets and tear gas while protesters threw rocks and bottles. As this didn't scare off the protesters, warning shots were fired in the air. After 10 minutes of warnings, it seemed the protesters were not budging. So, at 10:10 p.m., soldiers were ordered to lower the weapons into the crowd and start firing. Troops began open firing indiscriminately, and tanks started ramming through barricades and people alike, with no care for anyone's life. The crowd was stunned. They couldn't believe that their army was using live ammunition on its own citizens. As troops moved deeper into the city, the firing got even more indiscriminate, killing protesters and bystanders alike. Some soldiers even started shooting at people who were just watching from their apartment balconies. Around 1:30 a.m., troops had reached Tiananmen Square from the west. Soon, troops from other directions arrived too. By 2 a.m., students who had survived decided to leave the square any way they could. In the next hour, the student leaders agreed to the CCP demands to leave in order to ensure everyone's safety. At 5:23 a.m., a Chinese unit crushed the Goddess of Democracy statue, removing its severed torch first as a memento. The next morning, many civilians tried re-entering the square, but it was blocked off by infantry. Many of these people were parents of demonstrators who were in the square just last night. Many still had no clue what had happened to their kids, their brothers, their sisters. Everyone was panicking as they could see bloodshed and bodies on the side of the roads. This is where the famous Tank Man scene is from. Here, the guy is stopping a tank, then climbing on top of it and talking to the driver, likely asking about lost family members he had been searching for. He was soon removed from the street and was never seen again. The way that we have most of this information is through Chinese and foreign journalists who risked their lives to report on this massacre. Many had to hide the film in things like teapots to smuggle it out of China, because troops were deleting and destroying anything they could get their hands on. The death toll is a topic of debate to this day, where the CCP claims only 200 people died, all of which were American operatives trying to overthrow the government, while some independent foreign agencies claim that the number was as high as 20,000 people. For so many families, it was a day they will never forget. But for the CCP, it's a day that nothing happened. June 4th, 1989. YouTube just dropped a mind-boggling announcement. It is paying creators $64 million per day. Why? Well, because YouTube doesn't have enough creators. That is why you see videos on your homepage that have less than 1,000 views, like this one. Now, of course, that doesn't mean everyone should start a channel, but if you have ever wondered about starting a YouTube channel, or a faceless YouTube channel like this one, well, now's the perfect time. YouTube is paying creators millions every day, and it's pushing newer, smaller channels now more than ever. But I'm sure many of you have questions on how to get started and how to grow a channel. We get questions in our email all the time from some of you guys. So that's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one training bootcamp for the low, low price of completely free. So, if you're someone interested in starting your own YouTube channel, you can sign up for this bootcamp by clicking on the link in the description or on the screen. Sign up now because, unfortunately, unlike YouTube videos, the bootcamp is like a Zoom call, so it's limited to just 100 people. Okay, let's get back to the video.